My name is Jens Christian Hermansen. I am the editor of Kosmos, a quarterly magazine about spiritual science. I believe in the value of open-minded and critical thinking. I'm in London to meet Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. We are going to talk about science, God, and visions for the future. Sheldrake is a renowned British biologist. He's the author of more than 80 scientific papers and 10 books. He has previously been ranked among the top 100 global thought leaders, but he is also a controversial figure. He is part of a group of scientists and philosophers who are currently exploring the intersection between science and spirituality. Today we live in a secular age, as the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls it. We've seen a transformation of society from one in which practically everyone believed in God to a society in which God takes up no place or almost no place in people's daily lives. What is the biggest problem with the atheistic worldview as you see it?
I think the biggest problem with the atheistic worldview is, first of all, it's just not true. The idea that there's no form of consciousness beyond the human level, which is the basis of atheism, really. It says that there is no mind, consciousness, or spirit out there. If we form ideas about God or gods or goddesses or saints or angels, these are just human cultural constructs that exist in human minds and therefore in human brains, and they're just inside our heads. And they see it as their job to free people from these illusions, believing in things that don't exist. But they're just making the assumption, it's been built into science since the 17th century, that the whole material world is unconscious. It's not a proved fact scientifically, it's simply an assumption. And I think it's increasingly implausible. So atheism is a belief system, and it's a belief system that's basically deeply depressing. It can be liberating for people who've had an oppressive religious upbringing. For some people who've grown up in fear of hell and punishment and in a kind of puritanical moral order, then atheism is a liberation. It means they can have sex without feeling guilty and so on. So it's quite attractive for people at that stage. But in modern Europe, very few people have grown up with that kind of religious upbringing. Only about 5% of people have regular religious practices in Britain today. The vast majority of children grow up with no religious practice and no religious role models and no religious doctrine and no religious oppression. So atheism doesn't have that liberating effect, but it does have a depressing effect, that it says the whole world is basically pointless. Evolution's not going anywhere, it's just blind chance. The universe is not going anywhere, it's pointless and purposeless. Your mind's nothing but your brain, and when you die, it's all just wiped out. Your consciousness ceases forever. And it's basically a depressing worldview, and I think it's not a surprise that the predominant psychological problem of Western secular countries is depression. A massive scale of depression. We have millions and millions of people taking antidepressants to counteract depression. And if you have a depressing worldview, I don't think that's surprising.
I would like to return to the question of God. Do you believe in God?
Yes, I believe in God. But I come to my belief in God largely through experience. The experience of being connected to a consciousness vastly greater than my own, rather than through logical proofs. And I think that by God I mean a consciousness greater than our own that underlies the whole universe and underlies all conscious minds within it. Of course, I don't think of God as a man with a white beard sitting on a cloud. A lot of people think that the God they disbelieve in is that they have a childish vision of God, and they say, I don't believe in God. When I talk to my atheist friends, and many of my friends are atheists, then I have to say, you know, what kind of God don't you believe in? The God they don't believe in is a God that I don't believe in either. You know, some kind of masculine engineering figure outside the universe who designs the machinery of the world and then presses the start button like a kind of ultimate engineer. They don't believe in that kind of God because they think nature can go on perfectly well without that sort of God, and so do I. But I think that God is underlying the being of the world from moment to moment. God is not the cause of nature or the first cause of nature, just starting things off in the first place. God is the cause of the world existing from moment to moment, the very ground of the being of anything, why there's something rather than nothing. The whole world is, as it were, being recreated every second and sustained. We take it for granted normally. So anyway, that's, I say the God I believe in is generally speaking different from the God that atheists don't believe in, because most atheists don't believe in an incredible God that I don't believe in either.
When you say that atheism isn't true, can we explore that question in a scientific way, or is it possible to investigate this belief system in a more scientific way?
Well, it's interesting that the belief system of atheism is actually changing before our very eyes at the moment. Because of the hard problem of explaining consciousness, an increasing number of atheists are becoming panpsychists. That is to say, they believe that there's some kind of mind or consciousness, even in atoms or electrons, or in matter, that matter isn't totally unconscious. Panpsychism, pan means everywhere, psyche means soul. It's saying there's some kind of mentality or soul in all things. The reason they do that is because if they say that some kind of mind in electrons and in atoms and in molecules and in cells, then the appearance of consciousness in human beings is no longer a kind of miracle. It's a difference of degree, but not of kind. Whereas old-style materialism, appearance of consciousness is a difference of kind. It's a totally different sort of thing, which they can't explain. So there's a general move now among philosophers of mind and materialists to adopt panpsychism, which is really an updated form of animism, the belief that we live in a living world, that the whole universe is alive. Most of them have not thought through what this means. When they discuss the consciousness of electrons and so on, it's all rather academic. I think the best way to see its implications is to think about the possible consciousness of big things, like the sun. I myself think that if you adopt a panpsychist worldview, then it's reasonable to think that the sun is conscious and the stars, and that the entire galaxy might have a mind at a higher level than that of the stars, which are like cells within the body of the galaxy. And if the whole galaxy has a mind, why not the whole cosmos? And that's, after all, what our ancestors thought. They believed in the anima mundi, the soul of the world, that the whole universe had a mind. So I think that present-day materialists, when they switch over to panpsychism, aren't really aware of what a slippery slope they're on, because as soon as they adopt a panpsychist point of view, which I think is a much healthier one than old-style materialism, then it becomes, it soon turns into a kind of animistic worldview, and then that quickly turns into a kind of pantheism, because if the whole universe is conscious, then is that consciousness God? Then we get into a traditional argument. Is pantheism, it's a theological argument. Is the mind of the universe the ultimate reality, or is there a transcendent mind which goes even beyond the mind of the cosmos, and which all religions have thought there is. So within modern theology, I think one of the most interesting moves is towards a panentheistic view of God. Panentheism is different from pantheism, which says everything is God, and God is everything. Panentheism says that God is in all nature, but is not. Nature is also in God, so nature is in God and God's in nature, panentheism. So there's a transcendent aspect to God that goes beyond the universe. I think that's the most reasonable view myself.
In a lecture that you gave at Hollyhock in Canada some years ago, you said, and I quote here, "From panpsychism we get the idea of perhaps a cosmic consciousness." And panpsychism, you've already told a bit about that. It's a particular idea of consciousness. It's an idea that's becoming increasingly popular today. How do we get to an idea of God from panpsychism?
Well, I think what we get to from panpsychism is the idea of the universe. If you take panpsychism far enough, if galaxies have a kind of mind or consciousness, if galactic clusters have mind or consciousness, then what about the entire universe? And if the whole universe has a kind of consciousness, then we get back to the question we've already discussed. Is that God, or is there also an element of divine consciousness that transcends the universe as well as pervading it? But the idea that there's a consciousness beyond and more inclusive than our own level, I think is true of any thoroughly thought out panpsychist doctrine. If the sun is conscious, for example, then the consciousness of the sun would pervade the entire solar system, which is like the body of the sun. And the sun may know what's going on here on Earth. I mean, all traditional cultures portray the sun as having eyes, as seeing what's going on here. The Malay word for sun is matahari, the eye of the day. And the name we give to the flower, the daisy, is the same idea. The daisy has a center with all those rays like the sun, and the daisy means, in English, it means day's eye. It's the eye of the day. The Greeks, the Egyptians portrayed the sun as the Eye of Horus in the sun. So the consciousness of the sun may be witnessing all that's happening here on Earth, and that may be part of the consciousness of the galaxy, which may be aware of everything that's happening within the galaxy. So we're embedded within greater forms of consciousness, even just looking at the physical world that surrounds us without going to levels that may lie beyond that, further beyond that, like the ultimate divine consciousness. So I think panpsychism leads us to the idea of more inclusive levels of consciousness, not just one level, but many. And the traditional view in the Judaic and the Islamic and the Christian worlds is that there are indeed many levels of consciousness between the human and the divine, traditionally called angels. Now angels are not, in my view, beings with wings that, as you see in stained glass windows, they're kind of the intelligences of the stars and the planets and the guiding intelligences of nature. The Hindus call them devas. So all traditions have the idea of many, many forms of consciousness beyond the human level. The most extreme forms of Protestantism sort of collapse them down, so it's just humans and God, and the rest of nature's left out, and so are all the other levels of consciousness. And I think that's an extremely stripped down and unsatisfying view of the relation between ourselves and God and nature.
So, according to your view, the universe would be God's organism or something like that, if that's correctly understood.
Yes, I think it's the kind of organism that's inherent within God. In a sense, you see, the central part of the Christian message is that God can actually exist within a natural form. It can be incarnated as Christ. So the idea that it's not that God's separate from nature, but God's actually, through the incarnation of Christ, actually leading a human life on earth, eating and drinking and so on, and existing within nature and meditating in the mountains. But also the other part in Christian theology is that the second person of the Holy Trinity is not just the historical Jesus of Nazareth, but is the Logos, the creative formative principle, a bit like the Platonic realm of ideas, through which all things are made. And the Holy Spirit is the energy that enables them to come into being. So the whole universe is like the cosmic Christ. It's like the the incarnation of God in the entire universe.
Do you see some form of evidence for a panentheist's concept of God? Is that idea, the idea that God exists, a particular concept of God, is that concept testable in some way?
Well, I think the main reason that people first came up with the concept of God is because it was an experience rather than a deduction. And anyone who has a mystical experience has the feeling that their mind is part of a much larger mind than their own. I think that when people like Jesus had the experience of feeling that his mind was one with God, he wasn't arriving at a belief in God through studying the Hebrew scriptures. He was having an experience of that connection. So if we're looking for evidence of the existence of God in a panentheistic world, I think that the main evidence is going to come through personal experience. Science is based on experience. It's empirical, which means experience in Greek. And our own experience is experience too, and the experience of consciousness can only be known directly through consciousness. Someone measuring electrical currents in brains in a science lab can find out what's happening in your brain, but they can't find out what's happening in your consciousness unless you tell them. So anything to do with the exploration of consciousness has to be done through consciousness primarily. And that's what spiritual practices do. They link our whole body and the activity of our whole body, not just the brain, to kinds of experience which connect us with consciousness greater than our own.
Is there a connection between your panentheist's worldview or concept of God and your previous empirical and scientific work? Are these two things connected in some way?
Well, my scientific work is largely devoted to trying to find a more holistic approach to living organisms and nature. And I'm not alone in seeking a more holistic worldview. This has been going on for a long time. The philosopher that most clearly expressed it was Alfred North Whitehead, writing in the 1920s about what he called the philosophy of organism. Instead of seeing the universe as a machine, it's better to see it as an organism. The whole cosmos is like an organism. That makes even more sense in the light of our new evolutionary cosmology. The universe begins very small, and it grows and develops. And as it grows and develops, new forms and structures appear in it. That's nothing like a machine, but it's a lot like an embryo or a growing plant. And he thought that living organisms are true organisms. Even molecules and atoms are organisms. They're organic, holistic structures. That seems to me the most reasonable view to have of nature. And my own addition to that general holistic philosophy of nature is that these organisms have a kind of collective memory. Each kind of thing, each kind of crystal, or each kind of animal or plant has a collective memory. So if you train rats to learn a new trick in Copenhagen, then rats all around the world will learn that same trick quicker because the Danish rats have learned it. That's because of the collective memory given by the process I call morphic resonance. So that's part of what I'm doing. Another part is to say that our minds are not just the activity of our brains. Our minds are more like systems of fields that stretch out beyond our heads, just like a mobile telephone has an electromagnetic field within it, but it's not confined to the inside of the phone. It stretches out invisibly beyond it, which is why mobile phones work. I think our minds stretch out beyond our brains through mental fields every time we see something or every time we form intentions. And I think that's why phenomena like the sense of being stared at take place when people know that someone's looking at them, even if that person's behind them and not making any noise. This is a very well-known phenomenon. I've done a lot of experiments, and so have other people, that shows this is real. It's not just a superstition. It's a real phenomenon. And it happens because when we look at somebody, our mind reaches out and, in a sense, touches them, and they can feel it. if we form the intention to call someone on the telephone, then that intention reaches out and the person may feel it. So they may start thinking about us before the call. We're thinking about them, then we dial their number or make the phone call. During that period they start thinking about us, and when the phone call actually connects us, they say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." About 80% of the population have had that kind of experience. Within materialist science, the people pretend it's impossible and doesn't exist, even though lots of people experience it. So they say it's just an illusion or it's a superstition. But the experimental evidence shows that it does exist. I've done many experiments on this now. So I think that this more holistic view of organisms having fields and minds having fields that stretch out beyond the body, of there being an inherent memory in nature, instead of laws of nature, I think that the evolving universe has habits. So we have habits of nature rather than laws. All of this gives us a much more organic view of nature, which is experimentally testable. It has been tested. These experiments suggest that this really is happening. And it's one that fits much better with our own experience.
Thank you for watching. Please join us for our final episode about visions for the future.